need for change is at the heart of your ability to make it happen. Welcome to Turning Inward. I'm Vivian Carrasco, your midwife, teacher, and host for this podcast. Together, you and I are going to navigate the interior life. And we're going to do that by unearthing our personal truth, our own insight, and our inner knowing. These are weekly teachings that are brought to you by hard-nosed scientific evidence focused on spiritual direction with integrity and self-awareness. In 2 words, this is your inner work. Welcome back to another heart-to-heart conversation between myself, Nancy and Char, and we were just literally laughing out loud because there's just no way to get this wrong. We don't have a frame. We don't have anything set up. This isn't pre-planned or pre-whatever. We're just going with it, kind of like life comes at us. We can't predict what life's going to throw at us, so we can't predict what's going to come up in this conversation. But I do know, to the deepest part of my bones, that it is, I don't know, cool, good, fun, and interesting. What about you, ladies?
Yeah, good, fun, and interesting. I like that. It doesn't get any better than that. Agreed.
So, Nancy, tell us about your improv class that you just mentioned before I pushed record.
My one improv class.
It prepared you for life, you said?
Well, that's what I said before we got on the call. You asked if we wanted to have a little framework to set us up, and Char said no, and I instantly then felt I had to agree, especially since I have taken one improv class. And thought that, with that preparation, I should
enough.
be, just ready for anything in life anyway.
I want to do that. And I understand the premise, so tell me more about that. For improv is yes and.
Yeah, the whole setup essentially is, I think, like in my mind, I really thought it was sort of like it was supposed to be about comedy, like kind of trying to be funny, which is actually really hard to do if you're not present. And so the whole premise of the group coming together really is to be able, like Martha Beck says, essentially, to be in creative response with what is present. And then the furthering of that is that when somebody says something or hands you something or makes a gesture, all the different kinds of exercises and role playing and fun things that you can explore in that you greet whatever is kind of handed to you with a yes and. So it's kind of a practice more or less of being open and receiving and being able to be just responsive to that. And I mean, it really is like the best practice for life, because even if you think what's coming your way, you don't half the time, or it's, what is ever really what you expect it to be, really, So, and then as the group sort of forms this trust and fluidity, the humor that comes out of that is really just gut busting funny, like there's some moments. I think it's also kind of connecting in that vibe of, creativity is really how we connect into each other intuitively. So it's kind of that same thing. Like you all sort of end up being on this other vibe together where stuff just comes out of left field. And it's so funny. I recommend it. I think I almost feel like that's just what school could be for handling.
I wish.
Yeah. I would have
School of Life
enjoyed it.
Yeah. There is a sort of revolution, I think, in American education to be less, don't raise your hand until you have the right answer kind of thing. And I'm excited about seeing that, especially because eventually, hopefully I'll have grandkids going into that system. And it doesn't at the moment, and when I went through it, really facilitate that creativity and that generative, kind of creating. It's about, sit in a chair, sit up straight, be quiet, follow the rules, and the routine. Raise your hand when you have the right answer, kind of thing.
What's coming up for me as you guys are talking about this, though, is that you can, for an improv class, I'm guessing somebody set up a safe space for you all to do that in before you all jumped in and got really present with each other and said yes and to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a bunch of 5-year-olds in a classroom, you have to set up a safe space for them too, so that everybody and all their differences can be accommodated. And maybe, the strict rules was the best people could come up with in the past. And now that we've been through that, we see the limitations of that system and say, okay, what are the other ways we can set up safe spaces for kids to learn in?
That's beautiful. You're right, Char.
Well, I don't think that really happens in our school systems, but wouldn't it be beautiful?
My hope is that it's happening, that it is in progress. That what you said is exactly.
Would you say that the school system that your kids encountered was a safer space than the one that you went to?
Definitely.
Yeah, I would too.
Yes. So it's a growth and learning process, just like everything else. I actually saw something that said that they're teaching social emotional learning now. They have teachers, like there's a subject that is about, emotional intelligence. And I thought that was amazing.
Well, I remember, again, thinking about kindergarten. When my son first went to kindergarten, they had big posters in the classroom about, how to do conflict resolution. It's like, well, I didn't have that in my classroom.
I sure didn't either.
So, even if we could improve our, our conflict resolution skills, the fact that it's even a subject for 5-year-olds is fabulous. Just to agree with what you said. I agree with you.
Something that's coming up for me, and it's interesting, on the same note of this, yes, in the, sort of the school and learning and life, I cannot for the life of me think of what researcher did it or who came up with it, but there's some study that actually analyzes successful relationships, and in this case, marriage, because there's all kinds of relationships, right? Let's just throw that out there. So, but there was a ratio that they came up with on cues, like whether they're received or whether they're like blocked. So a silly cue would be something that I do all the time to my husband is, hey, look at that bird. Poor guy, he has no interest in it. So that's the cue. I'm saying it out loud. We're in relationship, and he says, there's always birds out there. That would be like a block. Or if he says, oh, cool. That would be a reception. So sort of that yes and. And I don't know why I wanted to say that. And maybe at some point I'll figure out who actually came up with that research. But I think that what you said, Nancy, about being open and receptive, and responsive to what's being given to you applies kind of throughout like the 80-20 principle, pretty much everything in the way we live.
Yeah. Well, because it's the opposite of controlling, right? Essentially. Like, you still have an ability to respond or be responsive, but it's without that defense, like you're talking about in that study, like without that wall there, that barrier.
And so you're co-creating something, right? That's better than anybody could have come up with on their own, theoretically.
Yeah, it's generative, like we talked about in one of our conversations. So I think the idea of learning, and that we have to learn how to do that, is what I'm feeling like I want to emphasize, because we do sort of like our instinct is to control, is to want certainty, but it's a delusion. So we have to teach ourselves, and I'm saying that because I believe that. And if you don't, tell me, but we have to teach ourselves how to be open and responsive and co-create. It's not something that comes, I believe it comes natural to us as human beings. We're taught out of it through, culture and society and, be safe, don't go past the fence, those sorts of things. So it's something we maybe relearn or retrain ourselves to do. And that's it posed as a question to y'all.
I think there's a balance to be struck. So if I picture an infant coming into the world, right, it's both very receptive and very ready to learn and make sense of the world it's appeared in. And also, it needs protection. It can't just just sit out in the snow, it will die. It can't live by itself. It needs to be cared for. So society and our egos serve a really important purpose. And we have to maintain that balance between that open receptivity, yes, and being very present and expanding what we're able to perceive, but also keeping ourselves safe, not opening up so much that we put ourselves in danger, our physical bodies and our psyches, in danger. So it's like, that's kind of like the human condition. And, what's needed at every stage of our lives changes a little bit, which is what puts us into those crazy cycles and transitions maybe. And again, now I'm really just like spitballing. So what do you guys think about that?
What's coming to mind as you were talking is just the idea of the role of protector in some way. And kind of going back to that school and learning space, how there's a way in which the adult or the authority or the teacher or the, whatever who we perceive or who is, in the case of a caretaker with an infant, the one in the role of caring and protecting, and how, it's the difference between sort of being in a fixed state where you are saying, well, I know what I'm doing and I know what we need to do to be safe and this is what needs to happen, and kind of enforcing that versus, and there are obviously, like infants need food, infants, like you're saying, Char, like there are very real ways where you have to take care of things. But then as children grow or we grow, it's like that tending, that nurturing, where you're kind of the difference between that fixed state and acknowledging difference environmentally, generationally, personally, and being able to see and encourage and empower others to come into their own learning and agency and accepting their insights and views so that like we can also evolve together. I really felt like my parents did their darndest to prepare me for the world that they live in. And my mom's 91. So they really wanted me to succeed, but could not seem to see that the world had changed or that what I wanted or what I was responding to, what was more present for me. So I think, some of the idea around kind of needing to be a perpetual student or learner in some way and staying in that collaborative kind of shaping relationship is kind of a key. Yeah.
Yes. I'm jotting down notes, and between what you said, Char, about cycles and transitions, and what you're saying, Nancy, about, tending and nurturing ourselves as we grow, is that learning, that continuous learning. Like we don't stay at a fixed state. We continue to evolve. We don't have to try to be, like you said earlier, about trying to be funny. We're becoming, right? We're an acorn turning into an oak tree. That's our natural process. It just needs to be, and throwing your words back at you guys, it just needs to be nurtured and protected. Yeah, because a tree won't grow unless it's watered in nutrient earth and given sunlight, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, you talked about delusion before, and I think, and this goes back to something we talked about in the last conversation too, about there being some kind of fixed destination you're trying to get to, or some ideal state, or, the delusion is that, you can ever get things to stand still, or that you're not always changing, that you're the same person you were yesterday, that 10 years from now, you'll be the same person you were today. None of that's really true, but it's part of the construct that we use to make ourselves feel safe, walking through life sometimes. And that's where the balance comes in my opinion, in being aware that we have this very useful tendency to try to predict what's going to happen next and be prepared for it. And also this other very useful tendency to constantly expand and push the boundaries. And we have to do both in just the right, not even just the right, we just have to do both. And that is what our experience consists of, and how well we calibrate, for what's right for our soul is how, satisfying and generative our life will be.
When you say balance, my being translates that into harmony and sees it as sort of the space between the notes. It's both, and it's the fixed note and it's the space of uncertainty. And that translates into our songs, our individual songs, and, our verses. And universe means one song. So all together, all those individual notes create. That's a total riff. I just got chills. I don't even know what that means.
No, that's very cool. I read something just recently, and I'm not even sure where. Okay. It was from a book called The Astrology of Midlife. And I only read a portion of the book, so I can maybe very much oversimplifying what this author was saying. But the midlife that I believe it was a woman identified, I can't remember her name, was the ages between 38 and 41, which is, a very long time ago for me. But in any case, what was fascinating about the astrology was that she talked about going from the whatever age we're in now into the age of Aquarius, which is supposedly in the next 25, 30 years is when we enter that age, that the whole sort of paradigm of how we form our societies and what we believe we're doing will change. And this was such a cool idea. Whereas now, and in the past, society was responsible for serving the individual. In the age of Aquarius, the individuals are all co-creating the society that nurtures them all. And again, I'm probably oversimplifying her point, but what I understood from that is that we're in the transition that's moving from the one to the other. And that made a lot of sense to me as far as how the way I'm viewing the world is changing, even as an older person who, has trouble sometimes seeing the world as it is now, as opposed to how I learned it was or how I wanted it to be when I was a younger person.
That transitional space.
But just seeing what the transition is from to me is fascinating. Yeah. Because it resonated for me as to what I believe looking at in the world around me and experiencing sort of within me,
Yeah. So for me, yes. So just reflecting back what you said about noticing the change within me. In very general terms, it went from a very strict sort of father figure on if I do something wrong, it's because I'm immoral, to more of this non-gendered, neutral, nurture, feed and care to bring out the best rather than, discipline and, punish and, that sort of thing. That would be my movement from, what I went from and where I'm to, and just noticing that, just bringing it to our awareness. And Nancy, you mentioned that a little bit, and, knowing, your mom and what she prepared you for and how that was different from where you were.
Yeah. And yes. And just kidding. My improv. I was really hearing what you were saying, Char. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that to me too, is that I think it's also very much Western culture that the I comes before the we, because I've done a little bit of traveling in Japan, and this may be, this is my overlay look, kind of at their culture from my eyes. But my experience of being there was a sense of society there highlights the we more so than we do here. And so I think, and they're not a perfect world or, they're not a perfect society either, but it was palpable to feel the difference between interactions and the way things operated, how systems and structures supported people in community, where the collective, the we, came first. And some of the ways that literally felt like, or seemed measurable were, for example, if you've been in New York City, and I know you have for sure, Char, because you live there, but like how crowded and busy the subways are and how, it's a little chaotic. And so riding a subway in Tokyo, which is, it may even be a larger city with just as many people coming and going. Yeah, it was quiet. People stand in line. There's like an order to it in some way because we're all sharing the experience of being on the train together. And so it's a we space. And so you talking loudly on your phone next to me disrupts my experience. And so that just doesn't really happen there in the same way. And again, I could be totally, my analysis on this could be totally missing things, but like there are ways in which I think we hear growing up and living in the United States where it's very hyper, it's all about the individual, me, hyper individual kind of thing, I think really is a lot of what we are awakening to now and how that has disconnected us from each other and that more collective, collaborative way of being, and how if each of us are sort of responsible for the culture we're creating, then we need to look at what we're doing and how we're interacting and how we're supporting one another to create those really expansive environments that are welcoming and creative and generative.
Yes. I want to say yes and again. Yes. And even so, I want to share my experience on the subway. I smiled too much. Somebody had to teach me and say, you don't smile here. Like you can't make eye contact and smile at everyone. And I'm like, oh, I guess that's because I'm from Texas. I don't know. But in my family, even though I'm in America, it was, you're doing it for the family. It was also a we. But I agree with you that we're moving into a space that is collaborative, which gives us a third way. It's not the, individualistic pull us up by our bootstraps. And it's not the, total sacrifice of giving up who you are for, the greater good. It's in the middle, and it can do both. Let us grow to our individual potential within a framework of purpose and sharing and whatever that serves both. And so the yes and. That's how I brought it back full circle. But you said something earlier, Char, that I wanted to get back to, and that was the idea of midlife and transitions. I have heard the term quarter life crisis, for 25-year-olds. And in my experience, we're not just having one transition, one midlife crisis. And I don't know why we call it that. We need a new term for it. Let's play a game and figure something out that sounds so much better than that. But these transitions are consistent, and maybe, I don't know, I see them evolve every 7 to 10 years, or maybe even longer, it transitions again. So we're always in that transition. Why are we calling them crises?
Yeah, they're not. I believe that we're actually always in transition. And the natural consequence of growth is to come to an end of a growth period, however long that is, depending on what it is you're trying to do, right? Like if we go back to the baby, right? The first kind of growth period is learning to walk and talk, right? The learning to walk part is a relatively short thing, a short period, by 1.5 maybe. And the learning to talk is a much longer, a kid doesn't really start conversing till they're a little older. But you get to the end of one life task, we'll say, and then there's another life task that opens up to you, right? So then you have to learn how to read, and, then you get educated, right? And then you, just to take the Western, path, because it could be anything for anybody, but then you go to have a career. So in Western society, there are these sort of like set parts of life at the moment that we're all sort of like pushed through, right? And so the big transitions that people have a lot of trouble with are the ones when you're going from one stage to another. So when you go from school to work, when you go from single adulthood to parenthood, when you go from work to not work, and there's millions of other things, if you have other identity things that you're working out, if you have illness, if you have, I'm sure I can't even think of all the variations there are to this. And even during your career, you probably, most people, they say, have at least 3 careers in their lifetime. And as we live longer, there's probably more. So all of those things make the crisis transitions, because we have to go from being competent, or the unconsciously competent at something, right, to being a beginner at something new. And I think in my life, there have been times when I started something new and didn't realize, as a sort of middle-aged adult, right? I already had a lot of experience behind me. Maybe I was in my 40s and my 50s. When I had to start over and be a beginner at something, it was damned uncomfortable, because I'm a grown-up. I'm one of the authority figures. I know all the answers. Everyone expects me to be competent at everything I'm doing. And yet I feel driven to try things that are completely new, and where I have to feel like a child again, like I'm the learner, like I'm the one who doesn't know, like I'm in the unknown, I'm in the uncertainty that you were talking about. And like, that's a courageous act that we have to like allow ourselves to be in that position over and over and over again. If, to me, that's the whole point of, continuing to live.
Wait, you just said, Char, there's a, yes.
Too much. I say too much all at once.
No, it's beautiful. There is no wrong way at this, right?
I know.
We did that. There's a book by Yuval Noah Harari, The 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And one of the concepts from that book that really stood out for me was exactly what you just said. I don't know what his background is. I think I forgot what he was. Darn it. But this book, he identifies that as the critical skill for us to learn in the 21st century. It's the shift in expecting our identities to have this, he uses the metaphor of a house, of a strong foundation and, built to withstand, and instead our identities and how we perceive ourselves, right? Who we are, our identity is no longer that house with a strong foundation. Instead, it's a tent. He said, because that's the shifts that are coming for us in the 21st century because of, technology and the bio thingies that, and the lack of privacy because of, big data and the whole bit. It's going to create this even more instability, and so that the midlife crisis doesn't happen at 40. It happens at 20, and it happens at 25 and 30 and 35. So we shift in our identities going to become even faster than it has been in the past, is what I'm getting from it. So yes.
Yeah. And it's already been happening for a long time. You ignore the fact that you need to constantly be reassessing whether your view of the world is accurate and whether the things you're doing are actually enough to, gosh, I don't even know how to express this, because even these ideas in my mind are crumbling. Enough, satisfying, what self-actualization, creative, productive, all of these things. All those things mean, even the definitions of all of those things for me are changing, because I think they need to change for our society.
I think, because I relate to what you're saying, the first piece is sort of that, any of those transitions, whether it's what you call midlife or, whatever, I think, yeah, really, like, I'd not thought about that before. Like, why do we call that a crisis? And I think maybe more it speaks to like that idea of crisis of conscience, like where you start realizing you're somehow a little bit like the farther you are out of integrity with yourself or the world around you, it's like these invitations to reorient. And I think the difficult part of some of that for me is the reality that like we all go through it. And yet there seems to be like a little bit of an absence of like we talk about it a little bit too, but like something about it, about the sense of individualness in going through that feels a little disorienting to me at times. That I think when people have a sense of community or an opportunity to relate about those, I mean, I kind of see them as almost like thresholds of undoing, where you have been living your life according to this operating system, and then through age or illness or, whatever, all the things you're talking about, where it's like we're invited to reorient ourselves internally into the reality we're experiencing and understanding more deeply how others are, we're not living a completely universal experience. And so expanding to incorporate a viewpoint that includes other people's lived experiences and realities. And I think it's where really kind of the beautiful progressive leadership and stepping into that unknown and kind of surrendering and understanding kind of what you were saying earlier too, Vivi, about how like the world we've created here is an illusion. And so if we're sticking to these rules or these ways of beings or these structures or whatever, like we can change them. And the more you become aware of that, the more you sort of lose your mooring for where and how to make decisions from, how to be who you are. Like it's rich, but it's also kind of scary. And I don't, everyone's like really leaping into that unknown, but I think it's where we're heading collectively.
Yeah. There's a quote that came to mind, and I don't know who said it, but it said that when you see a seed break open, it looks like it's coming undone. And so I'm connecting that to what we call a midlife crisis as an undoing. But what you just said, Nancy, is that it's actually a shift in looking at it from the inside. And if you look at what's happening on the inside of that seed, it's actually breaking through into its potential. And so I'm relating that to what happens as we move into transitions. And depending on where we are in that awareness of that transition, we could say, like you said earlier, Char, I'm thinking of these words, but even these words don't have the same meaning for me right now. You said they're crumbling. And that's beautiful to have that awareness,
It is. It's wondrous and uncomfortable and disorienting. All of those things at the same time.
Don't know why, and this might be completely off topic, but I recognize that my need to know why, the why, like somebody could be peeling an orange and I'm like, I wonder why they're peeling it that way instead of the other way. See, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it is just ridiculous. But I do this thing where I capture a moment in a picture on my phone every day. And I recently realized why I do that. I do that to train myself to see the wondrous, the differentness. I don't know the words that you use, Char, but that sort of, this is the same, but it's different. To notice, to create a new moment. I'm training myself to see that. Like I noticed that there's so many sunsets. It's the same spot that I take the picture, but every sunset looks totally different. But if I don't train myself to see that, if we don't train ourselves to see, like if a parent doesn't train themselves to see their child as an adult now, they'll always see them as whatever age they frame them in their mind, right? It's just seeing, noticing and looking at something deeply. We have to do that consciously, I think is what we've all said, is that it's something that happens naturally. If we aren't preparing ourselves for it, it becomes a crisis. But if we are noticing it as it unfolds for us, then it's everything at the same time. It's new and interesting. It's scary and difficult. It's unknown. And, it's everything at the same time, which is overwhelming. Yeah. But I think awe does that. When I look at something and I'm in awe, I'm overwhelmed at its beauty. And so here's what I want to say. This is what I want to say. I want to say that maybe that this is the conscious choice we can make. That most of our shift and change comes from pain and suffering just because we're that stubborn as a species, right? We've got to be kicked out of the nest in order to fly. But we're evolving into learning how to do it in a joyous way, learning how to turn our attention towards what we love and what brings us light and comfort, and follow that instead of the other way. That's what I want to say.
Yeah. And I think those are both sides of our being and both sides of how we grow that have their place at different times. We can't avoid the inevitable moments when we're kicked out of the nest. They're part of our evolution, our aging, and we also can, even in those moments, like you're saying, have access to that awe and joy. And one of the things that ancient societies seemed to have that we in Western society don't so much is, like support for the transitions, so that there's some sort of symbolic teaching about the rebirths that we go through during life and the losses that come with them,
Yeah, I've heard Joseph Campbell talk about that. Well, not in person, obviously, because he passed a long time ago. But in his writings and in his videos, he talks a lot about how our society no longer has rituals of, forgot what he called them, but we need those. Yeah, we need those rituals. And coming from a military background, that's one thing that the military does really well. It has those rituals built into it, the boot camp and the ceremonies, and it has that built into its sub-society because it creates comfort for us. We know that we're moving through a shift and we're doing it collectively, and this is what happens at the end of it. And that's the support, I think, that you said, Nancy, that we don't have as much in our society anymore.
Yeah, and especially, I think, it may exist a little bit more. I am of the post-religious sort of, I'm not a churchgoer or anything like that, but I think sometimes in some structured religions, there are some of those rites of passage still in some way. They're usually more about the church itself, kind of like I think of communion or those sorts of things where it's like relates more insular or to the faith or to the, but that's like the only place I can really think of that existing right now. And it's almost like, having that on a more collective or societal or non-denominational, kind of way would feel supportive, because I think rituals in the service of connection, I think, are really powerful. And in the service of unity, not unity in the sense that like you must conform, but like the expansive notion of unity, I think are really valuable.
That I'm not moving through this by myself. I'm not the only one going through this.
Well, just one little last thought about that too, is I think that what happens a little bit too, I think, especially if those are open to, children and elders and whatever too, is that like as a child, you understand that adults go through transitions and things too, that like it is an ongoing thing, that because there's some thread of it to me that feels a little bit like what happens here. And you alluded and maybe even said this literally earlier, Char, is like that idea that once you're an adult, you're done, you're, like, it all, you're, so like the notion that I think it helps us all to know that at every age we're navigating something, you're not like done and, that's boom. And somehow, like a little bit, I think it ends up sort of almost being like, oh, well, it's weak if you need help or something, but like we always need help. We need help through. So having that there and available and without shame. And, I just think that would be a really nice kind of sense of community coming together to have in this day and age, especially where I think there's an opportunity for some really big illusions and harmful things, to fall away of how we've been creating society, creating culture.
Yeah. I want to name that transition as it's coming up for me right now. So the before would have been looking for answers, and it's moving into So the transitional space is asking questions. And in your mind, imagine the word question. And then with your imaginary eraser, erase the ION. And it becomes a quest. This process that we're talking about that doesn't end. You follow it to where it leads you.
Yeah. And I might even go one step further and let it even be less active than a quest. You know, you could actually even, let it be an unfolding.
Yeah. Like a blooming of a flower.
Mm.
And this wraps us literally full circle to where Nancy said that the improv class, you have to stop trying to be funny.
Mm-hmm.
And you're present. It's that presence that unfolds. It's a different level of effort than trying.
Yeah. And so you might take all the same actions, everything about your surroundings and your story and, might all be the same, but how it feels when you're doing it is completely different.
Mm-hmm. Nancy?
Yes, and
I like this game.
Yes, and I don't know if I have anything to add to that. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, you know what? Unfolding reminds me of kind of opening gifts, and that element of surprise. And when you meet things with curiosity instead of trying to control an outcome, it's exciting. And it also kind of makes me think about the seed too, or, that seeds essentially, they have their power, they have their way of, growing, but so much of that is just receiving the sun, receiving the nutrients of the soil, receiving the water, whatever, like in order to, so it's like this really gorgeous cycle of kind of mutuality and reciprocity, which is sort of like the improv thing. Like that's sort of like what that was, like this circular kind of way of being, it's like you're sort of tending your own little ecosystem there. So everyone can kind of be a part of something. And, there are these individuals and these things happening, but you're tending to yourself and you're nurturing kind of this larger unexpected thing, and you don't know what's going to happen.
That's beautiful. And there's two concepts that actually, the circle and the receiving, they've been so loud in my intuition, in my awareness, and in my experience recently. And I played this game with myself and I wrote down a couple of things and I said, I wonder if it'll come up. And those were two of the three things. Instead of losing, gaining. In that trend, and I guess I can relate it to what we've talked about in this transitional space, we in our minds want to think we're losing something, but we're actually gaining something else. I related that directly to a conversation I had with my mom. She said her goal was to lose a certain amount of weight, and if I wanted to join her in that quest. And I said, no, thank you. My goal is to gain muscle. Like, I'm going to probably gain weight because muscle's heavier. And she said, oh, so it was a different thing, a transitional thing. And I just want to say out loud, because my society culture space wants me to say you should be embarrassed, but I weigh almost 200 pounds and I'm fine with that. Like I just said, I'm fine with that. And my stomach turned a little. So I'm not totally fine with that, but I really am. Like, this is how much I weigh. And a lot of it is muscle.
It sounds like, exactly that thing, like you were saying, yes, and, like, this is me. This is, I'm inviting, regardless of any number on the scale or what, we could have our own next 2-hour conversation about dieting and weight loss with me. But that sense of like, instead of saying what you don't want or what it's like just inviting in what you do, like kind of that. It's more of, I think, a little bit like a desire mindset.
Yes.
And I think we've been taught to see something like losing weight as a desire mindset in some way. But it's also like, well, what do you really desire is what you think that's going to give you. And you may not get there, trust me, but kind of saying that, like, you know, I want muscle, I want a sense of strength, or I want, you know, and sort of, it feels like that kind of attraction energy, that yes, and, you know, that inviting and blooming.
Yes.
Before the flower blooms, neither an observer outside of it, and possibly even the flower itself, has any conception of what it's capable of becoming. You know, you could argue that point, but it is also a possibility. You know, the first one certainly, you know, was a mystery, and until it appeared. But I think the reason that I'm saying this is I had an experience this week. I was at the salon, and it was a young woman's 30th birthday, and she was having a very emotional day. And it reminded me of me at my 30th birthday, because turning 30 was the hardest, like, actual birthday, you know, of all the decades that I remember, you know, coming to, right? That was the one that was the most dramatic and profound, and I would say awful, even still. So I was talking to her, and since she's like exactly half my age, I was reflecting about, you know, okay, so before 30 and all those decades after, you know, what actually happened to me as opposed to what I was thinking about at 30. And I said to her, I really want to tell you that, like, all the most wonderful things in my life, like things that I could weep, I'm so grateful for, they all happened after I was 30, every single one of them. And I came home and I talked to my husband, and I was like, just like, I was awestruck at the riches that were given to me, you know, with each new decade, even though society will say you're not young anymore, and so your best years are over. You know, it never felt that way. It just kept getting better and better and better and better, you know, and it's like, I couldn't know that from the other side. You know, I couldn't know that from my young self. I didn't have enough experience yet. I didn't get to the place where I was told, you know, it matters less and isn't, you know, as important. And find out, oh my God, it matters more, and it's more important, and it's more beautiful, and the things that are really, gosh, satisfying to me and worth having are none of the things that I thought they were when I was 20 or 25 or 30, which is not to say my life wasn't absolutely fabulous then either, you know? You know, I didn't lose any of the freedom I thought I was losing. It's just an illusion, you know? It's just fascinating to me to get to the point in my life where I'm looking at this and going, oh my God, like, I didn't even realize this before. Like, how, like, mysteriously bigger the real joy of growing and changing is. You know, it was that counterpoint of, you know, talking to that person that day and, like, having the, you know, stepping out and looking at the big picture. It was amazing.
I think it's even bigger and it gets even better. I think that's something that I've had to learn to accept, is that, yes, life will and does get better.
Even though you're so afraid because it's not what you're told to want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everyone tells me not to love my gray hair, but I'm not coloring my hair. It's silver for a reason. So I cannot believe the amount of time that's gone by, guys. So there are two things that I really want to remind you as the listener, as you tune into what we've said today, is what I heard. And maybe you heard something different. So you're your own best teacher. So listen to what your heart is telling you to tune into. But what I heard, because it's the work that I know that I do a lot with individuals and in groups, is what we talked about, and figuring out what we really want. The thing that you think you want might not be what you really want. And so think of what you want it to give you, like Nancy said. And, you know, being open to possibility and receiving is a message that I keep learning over and over and over again. So I wanted to kind of wrap up with those two insights and then turn it over to you ladies to share sort of that single seed or kernel that you want to reemphasize.
So what comes to mind for me in some way is like, maybe we don't need to take it all so damn seriously. That like, again, that like so much of what we think is reality is an illusion. And so, settling back into what feels good and true for you and orienting to the kind of experience and life you want to be living, and kind of not enforcing your, it's like, I kind of hate the idea that like sort of being more in a kind of receptive, creative mode then becomes this other diet, so to speak, where you have to enforce that in some way. But really, because, we're humans, we move all over the place, but just sort of like playing with practicing that over and over, like just kind of, feeling into possibility. If you kind of let go of the reins, sit back, laugh a little, see the illusion around you and think of it a little more as like a game, and imagine what other ways you might be able to be with things and create what you want to create. I'm just enthralled with the idea of being a beginner. That's what's coming up for me today. Just, the cultivating beginner's mind and tolerating the uncomfortability and uncertainty of not being expert, of not knowing, of having to try, trial and error, which includes like, forgiving your errors. That's what I'm drawn to today.
Beautiful. Thank you, Char. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Both. Mm-hmm. What a joy to have a conversation like this with you guys.
It is. It's true joy. And that we get to share it.
Yes.
So thank you for listening to our conversation.
If something needs to change and you don't quite know what it is yet, tune in and turn inward. I host an online learning community where we can figure it out together. Feels like a little family, and it's a place where you can be supported and offer support, because togetherness sparks change. Visit my digital home at viviancarrasco.com to learn more.